Cyrus Adama pressed the last seedling into the ground and stood up straight. 312 tomato plants. All of them sitting in shallow pockets of soil between limestone rock, on a hillside so steep that his boots kept sliding sideways when he walked. Behind him, at the base of the hill, a man in a Prest County Extension shirt was writing something in a notebook. Harold Meeks. Agricultural advisor. 22 years in the field. Harold wasn't writing a compliment. He had already submitted his official soil assessment 3 weeks earlier. The report used words like critically insufficient topsoil depth and hostile drainage characteristics and not recommended for commercial cultivation. He had driven out that morning because he thought Cyrus might have given up. He hadn't. Harold watched him plant the last seedling. Closed his notebook. Shook his head once, the slow, quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need words. 4 years later, researchers from the State Agricultural University would publish a paper specifically about that hillside. Premium buyers from 2 major food companies would be offering Cyrus contracts he hadn't asked for. And Harold Meeks would drive back up that same road, not to write a report. To ask Cyrus to explain what he had found. This is the story of what happened in between. To understand what Cyrus did, you first need to understand what everyone else saw when they looked at that hillside. The land sat at the edge of Cyrus's family property. 47 acres total, but only about 12 of them were what you'd call workable. The rest was this, limestone outcrops, shallow soil, a grade that made erosion almost inevitable when rain came hard. Every serious farmer in the region knew what that kind of land meant. You grazed goats on it. You left it alone. You certainly did not try to grow tomatoes. Tomatoes want deep, loose, well-draining soil. They want consistent moisture. They want root space. The conventional thinking, backed by decades of extension service data, said you needed at least 12 inches of good topsoil to grow commercial tomatoes reliably. Harold's soil cores from the hillside had come back showing an average of 4 inches. In some spots, 3. So why did Cyrus plant anyway? The answer starts with something he noticed when he was 12 years old. His grandfather had pointed it out, almost offhand, the way old farmers drop knowledge without realizing they're teaching. They were walking the upper edge of the property after a long dry spell, and his grandfather stopped and said, "You notice these rocks? They're always a little damp on the underside, even when it hasn't rained." Cyrus had never forgotten that. 20 years later, with his better land already at capacity and a market opening up for premium heirloom tomatoes, that memory came back. Not as a plan. Just as a question. Why were the rocks damp? What does that actually mean for growing? He started researching. Not casually. He pulled agricultural journals. He called a soil science professor at the state university, a conversation that would become important later. He read about limestone formations and how they interact with groundwater. What he was looking for wasn't in any of the extension service pamphlets. And Harold's report, precise as it was, had measured everything the standard protocol told him to measure. It hadn't measured what Cyrus was starting to suspect. Cyrus didn't tell anyone what he was thinking. Not at first. He wasn't secretive by nature. He just knew how it would sound. What he had pieced together, from his grandfather's observation, from the journals, from that phone call, was this. The limestone wasn't the problem. It was the entire point. Here's what the standard soil assessment doesn't measure: microbial networks. Specifically, a group of bacteria, a strain from the Bacillus family, that thrives in the alkaline microenvironment created by weathering limestone. These bacteria had been documented in academic literature, but almost exclusively in the context of natural cave systems and karst geology. Their agricultural implications were barely studied. What Cyrus had read suggested they do 2 things that are extraordinary for plant growth. First, they fix atmospheric nitrogen directly into the soil at a rate significantly higher than typical soil bacteria. Tomatoes are nitrogen hungry. This is why conventional growers spend heavily on fertilizer. Second, and this is the part that made his soil professor pause on the phone, they produce a biofilm on rock surfaces that dramatically increases moisture retention. That biofilm was why the underside of the rock stayed damp after weeks of dry weather. Cyrus wasn't looking at hostile land. He was looking at a biological system that had been building itself for decades, completely undetected, because nobody had thought to look for it there. The damp rocks are explained. But immediately. Will it actually work for tomatoes? Has anyone ever done this deliberately? And even if the biology is right, what about everything else? Yield, fruit quality, market value. He planted in the spring. He didn't tell Harold. The first season was strange in the best possible way. The plants established slowly, slower than conventional growth charts predicted. But they didn't die. The leaves darkened to a deep, almost aggressive green. The root systems, when Cyrus carefully excavated one plant to check, had done something he hadn't expected. They had grown sideways, threading into the crevices between the limestone, following the biofilm network like a map. Word got around, the way it does in small farming communities. People drove past and looked. Some stopped to ask questions. Cyrus answered carefully, saying only that he was testing some ideas. Harold heard about it. Didn't visit. By midsummer, the plants were producing. Not spectacularly, yield per plant was below commercial targets. But the fruit was different. Denser. The skin had a depth of color that made experienced growers stop and look twice. Cyrus wasn't ready to call it a success. He was watching the sky. The drought came in year 2. It came the way serious droughts come in agricultural country, gradually, then completely. March was dry. April was dry. May brought 3 inches of rain in the first week, then nothing for 11 weeks after. 11 weeks. Across the region, tomato crops were failing. Growers with good flat land and full irrigation systems were losing 30–40% of their yield. Unirrigated crops were total losses. Cyrus had no irrigation on the hillside. He had told himself it was a philosophical commitment to testing the system as it was. In truth, he hadn't had the capital. Week 3 of the drought, he walked the hillside at dawn. Week 5, he stopped sleeping well. Week 7, his neighbor called to ask if he'd considered pulling the plants and cutting his losses. He went back to his research. He reread everything he had on the bacterial biofilm and moisture retention. The data suggested the system could maintain soil moisture at root level significantly longer than conventional soil, but the papers had been lab studies, controlled conditions, not a real hillside in a real drought. Week 9, he drove to the hillside in the early morning, before the heat came. He pushed his hand into the soil beside a plant. It was still damp. Not wet. Not irrigated field wet. But damp. Alive. The biofilm network. Running through the rock fissures, pulling the last reserves of subsurface moisture, was still functioning. The plants were stressed. Smaller fruit. Slower growth. But they were alive. Every single one of them. This is the first major payoff. Land the silence before moving on. At week 11, when the rain finally returned, Cyrus stood in the hillside and looked at 312 tomato plants that had survived an 11-week drought without irrigation. He called the soil science professor. "You need to come see this," he said. Dr. Amara Osei arrived with 2 graduate students and more sampling equipment than Cyrus had seen outside of a university lab. They spent 4 days on the hillside. What they found confirmed everything Cyrus had theorized, and added details he hadn't known. The bacterial density in the limestone-adjacent soil was roughly 6 times higher than in the flat agricultural land a quarter-mile away. The biofilm network was more extensive than any recorded instance in a non-cave environment. And the tomatoes growing in this environment had responded biologically. Their root systems had developed a morphology, a physical structure, that maximized contact with the bacterial network, almost as if the two had co-evolved for this interaction. Dr. Osei told Cyrus she had never seen anything quite like it. The fruit quality data, the lab analysis, came back 6 weeks later. The tomatoes from the rocky hillside had lycopene concentrations 31% higher than the commercial baseline. Sugar acid balance in the range associated with premium heirloom varieties. And, most surprising, a mineral profile that reflected the limestone environment directly. Calcium, magnesium, trace elements that standard soil simply doesn't deliver in these concentrations. They tasted different because they chemically were different. The market responds. Cyrus hadn't gone looking for buyers. A chef in the city had gotten a sample from a farmer's market, a friend of Dr. Osei's. The chef called Cyrus directly. Then another chef called. Then a specialty food buyer. Then a regional grocery chain with a premium organic line. Each conversation started the same way. They wanted to know if he could supply consistently, and whether the quality was reproducible. The answer to both questions was yes. Because the biological system was self-sustaining. It didn't depend on expensive inputs. It depended on conditions that were already there. Other farmers start paying attention. The drive up to Cyrus's hillside became something of a pilgrimage. Farmers who had marginal land, rocky, sloped, not recommended for cultivation, started calling. They wanted to know if the same bacterial network might exist on their land. Whether this was replicable. Cyrus didn't have all the answers yet. But Dr. Osei's team was building a testing protocol. The university had begun a formal research program. Harold Meeks retired from the county extension service in the spring of year 4. 2 weeks after his retirement, he drove up to Cyrus's property. He didn't call ahead. He just drove up. Cyrus was on the hillside when Harold's truck came up the road. He watched him park, watched him climb the fence at the base of the hill, watched him walk up through the plants. Harold stopped beside a row of tomatoes. Looked at them for a long moment. Looked at the limestone rock beneath them. "I read the university paper," he said. Cyrus nodded. The bacterial network. The biofilm. The moisture retention. Harold was quiet for a moment. "I've assessed a lot of land over 22 years. I didn't know to look for that. None of our protocols measured for it." "Nobody's did," Cyrus said. Harold crouched down. Pressed 2 fingers into the soil beside the limestone rock. "Still damp," he said. "Always is." Harold stood up. Looked out across the hillside, 312 plants, 4 years old now, the limestone outcrops threading between them like ribs. "My report said this land was unsuitable," he said. "And by every measurement I had, it was. I want you to know, I wasn't wrong with the tools I had. But the tools weren't enough." It was, Cyrus thought, about the most honest thing a person could say. "There's a farmer 2 counties over," Harold said. "Rocky hillside. Wants to plant. I told him to call you." Cyrus looked at him for a moment. "I'll talk to him," he said. The university paper was published in the 3rd year. It has since been cited in agricultural research across 4 countries. Dr. Osei's team identified similar bacterial networks on limestone-adjacent land in 11 additional sites across the region, land that had been classified as marginal or unsuitable for decades. Cyrus expanded to the adjacent hillside in year 3. By year 4, he was supplying 4 restaurant groups and a regional premium grocery chain. The Extension Service updated its soil assessment protocols to include microbial network testing. Harold was listed in the acknowledgements of the university paper. He had contributed his original soil data. It turned out his precise measurements, the ones that said the land was impossible, were exactly what the researchers needed to show how different the biological reality was from the conventional assessment. Even a report that got it wrong can help someone get it right. If you know someone farming on impossible land, share this video. And if you want to understand more about biological soil networks and what modern agriculture is still missing, subscribe. That's exactly what we cover here.